The wedding was supposed to be pure joy, but when I opened a text saying, "Don't come," my world shattered, and the real nightmare began 20 minutes later when the groom himself opened fire on the police. The crisp linen of my best suit felt like armor, tailored perfectly for a day that was supposed to be pure, unadulterated joy. My granddaughter, Lily, my little bird, finally taking flight. The sun, a brilliant, almost arrogant disk in the late June sky, beat down on the manicured lawns of the Blackwood estate, a venue so opulent it made my old bones ache just looking at the price tag. I smoothed the lapel, a nervous tic I've had since my own wedding 50 years ago. I was the patriarch, the one who walked her down the aisle, the man who'd taught her how to skip stones, and more importantly, how to spot a charlatan from a mile away. Lily was sunshine and steel, a perfect blend. Today she was marrying Thomas, a young man whose family roots were as deep and old as mine, or so I thought. They looked perfect, bathed in the soft glow of anticipation as guests milled about, sipping champagne and murmuring polite congratulations. My phone buzzed in my inner pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a reminder about the toast I had painstakingly written, a tribute to her mother, lost too soon. But the screen held a message that felt like a shard of ice dropped directly onto my heart. It wasn't a familiar number. It was just a string of digits, anonymous and cold. The message read in stark, unpunctuated text, "Don't come." My breath hitched. I checked the sender again. Nothing. No name, no area code I recognized. I almost laughed, a harsh, brittle sound in the back of my throat. A prank? Some disgruntled college kid trying to inject drama into a society wedding? But the sheer, blunt command settled heavy in my stomach. Lily was due to walk down the aisle in 20 minutes. This wasn't the time for jokes. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the seating chart went wrong. Maybe the florist bolted. But the capital letters screamed a different narrative, one of urgency, of fear. I looked up at the grand, ivy-covered facade of the reception hall. My hands started to tremble, the fine crystal flute of my champagne vibrating against my palm. I texted Lily's mother, my late daughter's best friend, the wedding coordinator. Anyone. No reply. They were all sealed off in the pre-ceremony bubble. Then a second text arrived, seconds later, from the same unknown number. It was shorter, more specific, and infinitely more chilling. "She isn't who you think. If you value her life, stay away. I have eyes everywhere." My carefully constructed composure shattered. This wasn't a joke. This was a threat, aimed directly at the most important person in my life. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "If you value her life." The words echoed in the otherwise cheerful din of the party. I knew Thomas's family. They were pillars of the community. But I also knew that old money often came with dark secrets buried deep beneath the manicured lawns. I looked towards the entry arch where the string quartet was tuning up, ready to strike the fateful bridal march. 20 minutes had become 10. I could run. I could pretend I had a sudden heart attack, faint dramatically, and be whisked away by a concerned chauffeur. I could save myself the confrontation, the scene. But then what? I'd live the rest of my life wondering if I had abandoned my granddaughter to some unseen danger because of a cryptic text message. I crumpled the paper napkin in my fist, the scent of gardenias suddenly sickly sweet. My mind raced, discarding scenarios faster than I could process them. Lily was marrying a stranger, maybe? Or was this about something Thomas's family had done years ago? I remembered the strained look on Thomas's face during the rehearsal dinner last night. a flicker of something cold behind his practiced smile. I made a decision that felt both insane and absolutely necessary. I couldn't trust the situation. I couldn't trust the silence from the people inside. I needed certainty. And if the situation was dangerous, I needed backup that didn't have vested interests in the Blackwood name. I moved away from the throng of guests, slipping behind a massive ornamental hedge that screened the service entrance. I fumbled for my other phone, the one I keep exclusively for emergencies, the one connected to friends who still owed me favors from the long-gone days of my career in international security consulting. I dialed the number I hadn't touched in 5 years. "It's Marcus. I need eyes on the Blackwood estate. Immediately," I whispered into the phone, my voice tight. "High alert. Wedding in 10 minutes. I need a discreet security sweep, perimeter and interior. And Marcus, if you can't guarantee absolute discretion, I need something else." There was a pause on the line, the silence stretching thin. Marcus knew my tone. He knew when I dropped the polite facade. "What else, old friend?" he finally asked, his voice low and gravelly. I looked back at the glowing venue, the place where my world was about to pivot into horror or relief. My decision felt final, irreversible. "Get me a uniform detail, 2 marked cars. I want the police on standby outside the gates. Tell them it's a potential domestic disturbance, highly volatile. And Marcus," I swallowed hard, tasting copper, "tell them I am arriving with them." Marcus didn't ask questions. That was why I kept his number close. He simply replied, "ETA 7 minutes. Stay put until they arrive. Do not engage." 7 minutes. 7 minutes until Lily walked out, radiant and utterly unaware that her grandfather was planning to crash her wedding with the local constabulary. The absurdity of it almost made me choke on my own fear. I pictured the scene. The string quartet screeching to a halt, the stunned silence of 200 high society guests, and then the heavy, authoritative tread of uniformed officers accompanying the man who was supposed to be giving the most loving speech of the decade. I shoved my phone back into my pocket, forcing my legs to move with the casual grace of a man enjoying a beautiful afternoon, not a man bracing for a siege. I needed to get closer to the main entrance without being seen by the caterers milling around the side tents. As I circled the back of the hedge, I spotted a familiar face, or at least a face I remembered from the engagement party last Christmas. Mrs. Albright, Thomas's aunt, dripping in diamonds and radiating judgmental disapproval. She spotted me immediately, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rising. "Arthur, you look pale, dear boy. Is everything all right?" she called out, her voice carrying with unnatural clarity across the lawn. "The bride is about to make her entrance. You shouldn't wander off." "Just suddenly feeling the need for some air, Eleanor," I managed, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Remarkable day." She leaned in conspiratorially, smelling strongly of expensive French perfume and something faintly metallic. "It is, though I must say Thomas's family has been unusually tense this morning. Did you notice Thomas pacing near the stables earlier? He looked like he'd seen a ghost." A ghost. That's what the text implied, a past haunting the present. Thomas, the perfect fiancé, pacing nervously. It was a small detail, but in the high-stakes game I was now playing, small details were the only things that mattered. "Perhaps cold feet," I said lightly, forcing a chuckle that sounded brittle even to my own ears. "Cold feet? Not Thomas," Eleanor scoffed, shaking her head. "If Thomas has cold feet, it's because he's already running from something else entirely. Keep an eye on him, Arthur. I have a very bad feeling about this whole affair." She drifted away, presumably to find someone more interesting to gossip with, leaving me utterly unnerved. Eleanor Albright was malicious, yes, but she wasn't usually wrong about undercurrents of tension in high society. I glanced at my watch. 5 minutes remaining. I could hear the muffled sounds of activity inside, the final check of the flowers, the rustle of Lily's dress, no doubt. I had to get eyes on Lily herself before the police arrived. If the threat was real, if someone was watching, I needed to know she was safe now. I decided to risk a dash toward the chapel doors. I moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows cast by the sprawling oak trees. Just as I reached the edge of the stone patio, I saw movement near the back service exit of the main hall. A figure, dressed entirely in black, moving with a speed that was jarringly professional against the backdrop of pastel dresses and silk ties. They weren't a caterer. They weren't a guest. They were focused, moving with purpose toward the area where the bridal party was sequestered. My training kicked in. I dropped into a crouch behind a large stone planter, reaching once more for my phone, forgetting Marcus's instruction to wait. I needed a better look, confirmation of hostile intent. I risked pulling out my small, high-powered binoculars, a relic from my military days, and focused them on the figure in black. They were reaching into a satchel, pulling out something long and dull. It wasn't a weapon, not immediately obvious, but the way they handled it suggested expertise. As they turned slightly, angling away from the hall, the late afternoon sun caught the object for a fleeting second. It was a specialized camera tripod, the kind used for long-range surveillance or broadcasting. But the figure wasn't setting it up to film the ceremony. They were aiming it away from the crowd toward a discreet access point near the organ loft. And then the figure adjusted the lens, bringing it into focus, not on the ceiling, but on a small, ornate silver locket Lily always wore, a locket that held the only existing photograph of her deceased mother. It was a specific, intimate piece of targeting information. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't about money or status. This was personal, obsessive, and deeply malicious. They weren't planning to stop the wedding. They were planning an intimate, targeted attack on Lily, likely timed for the moment she was most vulnerable, exposed, and distracted by the vows. The sound of the string quartet's first tentative notes, the prelude, drifted through the open doors. Time had run out. I looked down the drive, and through the shimmering heat haze, I saw them. 2 official black and white patrol cars, lights silently flashing, pulling up to the wrought iron gates. I pushed off the planter, shouting Lily's name, sprinting toward the main doors just as the first officer stepped out of the lead car, pulling his radio to his mouth. But as I rushed forward, the figure in black, alerted by my sudden movement, or perhaps by the arrival of the cars, spun around. They didn't run. Instead, they threw a small metallic sphere onto the ground near the patio steps. It didn't explode. It hissed, releasing a thick, choking cloud of dense white smoke that instantly billowed outward, obscuring the entire entrance and enveloping me. I stumbled, blinded, hacking and coughing, desperately trying to push through the chemical fog toward where I thought the doors were, only to collide hard with something solid and unexpected. I wasn't running into the chapel. I was running into the back of one of the waiting police officers who had just exited his car, now caught in the toxic cloud. "Hold your position! Who are you?" the officer roared, his voice distorted by the smoke, his hand immediately going to his sidearm. I tried to shout an explanation. "It's my granddaughter! The text! Stop them!" but only a strangled gasp escaped my lungs as the officer, reacting to the panic and the strange elderly man emerging from a chemical cloud, shoved me back, his reaction milliseconds too slow to avoid the man who was suddenly, silently, right behind him. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side, a blinding impact that drove the air from my lungs, followed immediately by the terrifying realization that the figure in black hadn't just thrown smoke. They'd used the diversion to close the distance, and now one of them, or perhaps both of them, were inside the police perimeter, and I was on the ground pinned by a confused officer, watching through the dissipating smoke as the chapel doors swung wide open and the sound of the organ swelled, not for the bride, but for the arrival of the groom. And Thomas, the groom, was walking out of the chapel, not in, flanked by two other men in dark suits, his expression completely devoid of joy, holding a gun aimed directly at the approaching patrol cars. The world tilted. The agony in my side was secondary to the horrifying tableau unfolding before my watering eyes. Thomas, my supposed future grandson-in-law, was the aggressor. The calm, collected fiancé was a decoy, or worse, the ringleader. He held the firearm, a sleek, professional-grade weapon that belonged nowhere near a wedding, and he was leveling it with lethal intent at the two officers trying to secure the perimeter. "Stay down, sir! Do not move!" The officer pinning me down barked, mistaking my shock for resistance, his body shielding me from the line of fire, ironically placing himself between me and the immediate threat. The heavy, dramatic notes of the organ music meant to herald Lily's entrance now served as a perverse soundtrack to an ambush. The guests, still milling about, blissfully unaware just beyond the initial blast radius of the smoke, would be utterly exposed once the gunfire started. I clawed at the officer's grip, ignoring the searing pain that suggested a broken rib, perhaps worse. "He's armed! He's aiming at the police! That's Thomas, the groom!" I yelled, my voice raw. My shout finally registered over the blare of the organ and the rising panic of the guests, realizing something was terribly wrong. The officer hesitated for the fraction of a second required to pivot his gaze toward the chapel entrance. That fraction was all Thomas needed. A sharp crack split the air. It wasn't the sound of Thomas firing. It was the sound of the police radio exploding in the officer's hand. The man had been proficient. He'd shot out the communication device before anyone could call for backup or report the active shooter. "We need to move!" The officer next to me yelled into his shoulder mic, realizing they were effectively blind and isolated. I saw my chance. With a surge of adrenaline fueled by sheer paternal terror, I bucked violently, slipping out from under the officer's grasp. I scrambled to my feet, my vision swimming, and bolted toward the chapel doors, straight into the path of the chaos. Inside the smoke-tinged foyer, the scene was pandemonium. Guests who had been waiting at the threshold were now screaming, flattening themselves against the marble walls. The wedding planner was hysterical, her pristine clipboard abandoned on the floor. But Thomas and his two companions, the silent, menacing figures from the service entrance, were focused solely on containment. They were funneling the terrified crowd away from the main sanctuary and toward the smaller side rooms. "Keep them calm! No phones!" Thomas barked, his voice unnervingly smooth, the charming fiancé persona completely dissolved. He looked directly at me, his eyes cold chips of blue ice. "Arthur, I asked you politely to stay home." He raised his weapon again, not toward the police outside, but directly toward me. "Where is she, Thomas?" I demanded, my hands held up in a gesture of surrender, though my mind was screaming tactical maneuvers. I had to buy time, draw his attention away from the entry point where the rest of the police backup would eventually breach the gates. "She's safe for now," Thomas sneered, taking a deliberate step toward me. "Safely tucked away where you won't find her until the payment clears. You see, Arthur, this wasn't a wedding. It was an acquisition, and you, unfortunately, are an obstacle." Before I could process the meaning of payment or acquisition, a piercing, high-pitched alarm began to sound from deep within the estate's lower levels. A security alert I recognized immediately from the blueprints I'd reviewed for the reception layout last year. It wasn't the main alarm. It was the silent alarm hooked directly into the private security firm Thomas's family supposedly used. Thomas whirled around, distracted. "What is that? Who triggered the internal lockdown?" His two associates immediately moved to secure the main chapel exit, their attention drawn to the possibility of an inside breach. And that was my signal. I didn't head for the police outside. I didn't try to tackle Thomas. I ran the opposite way, back toward the bridal suite where Lily had been waiting just minutes before, relying on the faint hope that the cryptic text hadn't been about preventing her arrival, but about warning her about the trap she was about to walk into. I shoved past a paralyzed bridesmaid and burst through the swinging door into the anteroom connecting to the main bridal preparation area. The room was empty. The beautiful ivory dress lay discarded over a chaise lounge, the veil pooled on the floor like melted silk. But Lily wasn't there. My heart plummeted. She hadn't been waiting here. She'd already left this room before I arrived. My eyes swept the area frantically, searching for any sign of struggle, any note, anything that would give me a clue to her location. And then I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible scuff mark on the highly polished hardwood floor, leading not toward the main hall but toward a heavy, ornate grandfather clock standing sentinel in the corner of the dressing room. It wasn't just a clock. It was too large, too deliberately placed. It was a door. I wrenched the heavy wooden pendulum casing open, revealing not gears and weights, but a dark, narrow opening leading down into the blackness of the estate's rumored Prohibition-era tunnels. I could hear the muffled sounds of confrontation growing louder, shouts, the officer yelling again, and Thomas's cold voice issuing demands. I leaned into the opening, shouting down into the suffocating darkness. "Lily, are you down there?" A faint sound drifted back up. Not a cry for help, but a quiet, determined whisper, almost snatched away by the distant chaos. "Grandpa, I'm not alone. He's here too." "He's here too." The whispered words echoed in the small dressing room, colder and sharper than any sound Thomas could have made with his gun. He who? The text had warned me about coming. The subsequent threats implied Thomas was the danger. But if Lily was already in the tunnels and she mentioned another he, the entire threat matrix had just multiplied into something monstrous. I scrambled backward out of the clock doorway, slamming the heavy oak panel shut just as the main door to the dressing room burst open again. It wasn't Thomas this time. It was one of his enforcers, the man who had been aiming the surveillance camera. He was covered in dust from having apparently just come from the outside perimeter, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He saw the disturbed clock, the discarded dress, and then his eyes locked onto me. "The old man's gone rogue," the enforcer snarled into a wrist communicator, backing slowly into the room, blocking the exit I had just used. "Target 2 is compromised. Secure the primary asset." I was trapped between two deadly possibilities. The external chaos erupting on the lawn involving Thomas and the police, and the internal threat of these professionals hunting Lily in the hidden depths beneath the estate. "Where is she?" I demanded, my voice steadier now. years of suppressed instinct kicking back into overdrive. I might be old, but I was not defenseless. I was the man who taught Lily to spot a charlatan. The enforcer smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of the lips. She's with the man who matters, old-timer, the man who actually owns this legacy. He started advancing, his hand moving toward his own weapon holstered at his lower back. I knew I couldn't take him in a straight fight, especially with my injured side screaming at every movement. My eyes darted around the room, seeking anything that could offer a momentary advantage. The makeup table scattered with expensive potions and brushes, the heavy ornamental silver hairbrush Lily's mother used to favor. As the enforcer drew his sidearm, I lunged, not for him, but for the wall behind him, smashing my fist into the ornate sconce holding the room's main light. The glass shattered, plunging the room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the slivers of afternoon sun slicing through the window curtains. I dove low, rolling under the trajectory of his panicked first shot, which shredded the expensive wallpaper where my head had been moments before. In the darkness, I scrabbled desperately for the discarded silver brush on the vanity. The enforcer was good. He adapted instantly, moving toward the sound of my scrambling. "Stay still, or I start shooting at random." "I know what you are," I spat, finding the brush. It was heavy, solid, sterling silver. "Your cleanup crew. Who sent you for Lily?" "The other one," he breathed, closing the distance, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. "The real patriarch." That sealed it. Thomas was a pawn, a handsome distraction placed there to marry into the family wealth and deliver the prize. The real threat was someone from Thomas's lineage, someone powerful enough to command mercenaries and hide tunnels beneath a wedding venue. I brought the heavy brush up in a wide, sweeping arc, connecting with a sickening thud against the side of the enforcer's head. He stumbled, dropping his weapon, the sound of heavy metal clattering on the hardwood floor. He didn't fall, but he staggered, momentarily stunned, clutching his temple. This was my only window. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I spun around and threw myself back toward the clock, ripping the door open. "Lily, I'm coming down!" I dropped into the tight, dusty passage, feeling the wooden frame scrape painfully against my ribs. I slid down the rough wooden planks of the makeshift ladder, the tunnel floor meeting my feet with a jarring thud. It smelled of damp earth, old wine, and something else, something faintly metallic like aged blood. I pulled out my phone, switching the flashlight to its highest beam. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to stand abreast, and it branched immediately into three distinct paths. One tunnel was clearly unused, choked with cobwebs. The other two showed signs of recent use, scuff marks, a few discarded cigarette butts, and a faint, lingering trace of that metallic scent. I aimed the beam down the left path, hearing a faint, rhythmic dripping sound. Then, down the right path, I heard it. A low, strangled cough, followed by the sound of fabric snagging on stone. "Lily?" I whispered hoarsely. The cough came again, weaker this time. "Grandpa? The other man? He tied me up. He won't let me call anyone." I started running down the right-hand passage, ignoring the protest of my body, the dust in the air making my lungs burn. I rounded a sharp bend, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive blackness, and there she was, Lily. Her beautiful white gown was filthy, snagged on sharp pieces of exposed rebar protruding from the rough-hewn wall. She was slumped against the stone, secured tightly to a thick support pillar with heavy-duty zip ties, the kind used for industrial restraints. But she wasn't alone. Kneeling beside her, calmly examining the knot of the zip tie with a specialized cutting tool, was a man I recognized instantly from the few, grainy photos my late daughter had kept hidden away. Photos she'd always warned me never to show anyone. He was older than Thomas, distinguished, with an air of chilling authority that transcended mere menace. It was Marcus, my old security contact, the man I had called barely 20 minutes ago for help. He looked up from his work, his face unreadable, the beam of his own small tactical light catching the glint of recognition in his eyes. "Arthur?" Marcus said, his voice completely level, free of the gravelly urgency he'd used on the phone. "I told you to wait. You should have stayed on the surface with the distraction." He held up the small, silver-bladed cutter, having expertly sliced through the final plastic tie binding Lily's wrists. "Now, we have a problem." The silence that followed Marcus's calm address was deafening, broken only by the frantic, shallow breaths Lily was taking as the pressure released from her wrists. The betrayal was a physical blow, far worse than the enforcer's attack above ground. Marcus, the one man I trusted with my deepest secrets, the only one I'd called for protection, was not just complicit. He was the architect of this abduction, working alongside the groom's true family. "You," I managed, the word a scraping indictment in the suffocating dust of the tunnel. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the loyal operative with the man currently freeing the hostage he was supposed to be locating. The text, the warning. It was all a setup. Marcus stood up slowly, tucking the cutter away with the same neat precision he'd used to sever the restraints. He was not wearing the typical tactical gear I'd expected. He was dressed in tailored dark gray, the same shade as the suits worn by Thomas's men upstairs. "A brilliant one, too, wasn't it?" Marcus agreed, nodding toward the tunnel entrance where Thomas and his men were likely engaging the first wave of arriving police officers. Thomas was necessary to gain access to Lily's trust, and more importantly, to your trust, Arthur. You're the access point to the Harrington Trust, which, as you know, legally transfers control to Lily upon marriage. But Thomas's family couldn't risk a public wedding. We needed her isolated, quiet, and ready to sign the final documents relinquishing control over those offshore assets you were so keen to protect. Lily, finding her voice despite the lingering trauma, scrambled away from Marcus, clutching the torn remnants of her dress. "He said he was sending help, Grandpa. He said he was leading the police to you." "He was leading them to the distraction," I corrected grimly, finally understanding the depth of the deception. Marcus hadn't been working for me. He'd been running interference. The message, "Don't come," wasn't a warning for me to avoid the wedding. It was an instruction for him to make sure the police thought I was the primary incident, drawing attention away from the tunnel extraction. "The police on the lawn are dealing with a very convincing hostage situation orchestrated by Thomas," Marcus explained, gesturing back the way I came. "They think Thomas is the volatile groom holding the bride. By the time they realize he's merely muscle, we will be long gone. And thanks to your timely arrival, Arthur, you're the perfect fall guy for the entire operation going sideways upstairs." He took a deliberate step toward me, his face grim. "Now, you have a choice, Arthur. You can follow me back up, and we can discuss your cooperation regarding the trust documents, or you can stay here. The air circulation down here is poor, and I don't have time to clean up any further messes." The implication was clear. I would die in the tunnel, blamed for the chaos, while Marcus delivered Lily and the assets to the real masterminds, the people behind Thomas. But Marcus had made one critical error. He hadn't counted on me having an ace up my sleeve, an insurance policy that always superseded my primary contact. My first phone call to Marcus was the decoy. My true fail-safe was activated the moment I felt that text message was genuine. "You always were too reliant on technology, Marcus," I said, dropping the heavy silver brush onto the stone floor with a resonant clang. My hand moved not toward my pocket for a weapon, but toward my collar, where a nearly invisible wire ran down my shirt. Marcus paused, his expression flickering with genuine surprise for the first time. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 20 years ago," I spat. "Cutting my losses." I ripped the small, flat device from its adhesive backing beneath my shirt, a miniature satellite tracker and emergency beacon I always wore during high-risk operations. This device wasn't linked to the local police or Marcus's network. It was linked to a retired SEAL team operating covertly out of an unmarked chopper stationed 20 miles north, the only people who knew my real contingency plan. I slammed my thumb down on the activation stud. The tunnel immediately filled with a deafening, high-pitched electronic shriek, a targeted frequency designed to overload any sophisticated listening equipment, including the earpieces Marcus and his men were surely wearing. Marcus recoiled, clutching his head, his carefully constructed composure finally breaking into a grimace of pain. "You son of a—" But before he could recover or even finish his threat, the earth above us began to shake violently. It wasn't the localized chaos of the fight upstairs. This was a deep, structural vibration, the sound of heavy machinery being deployed rapidly and without subtlety. The ceiling above us groaned audibly. "What is that?" Lily shrieked, her fear instantly replaced by confusion. "That," I said, dragging Lily toward the unused, cobweb-choked tunnel, the one Marcus said showed no signs of use, "is my exit strategy. That's a tactical breach team arriving from directly overhead." The metal fittings on the wall above Marcus shrieked as if being torn apart. A blinding, focused spotlight sliced through the tunnel ceiling 20 feet behind Marcus, followed by the deafening roar of industrial-grade cutting torches, eating through the bedrock. Marcus realized his mistake instantly. He'd assumed the conflict was confined to the wedding reception above. He hadn't accounted for the fact that I call for backup when I'm serious, and my backup doesn't use the front door. He spun around, abandoning the immediate capture of Lily, realizing the SEALs were about to drop into his position, effectively cutting off his escape route back to the main tunnel intersection. "No, not this way," he screamed, pulling his weapon and firing wildly at the blinding light descending from the ceiling. I didn't look back. I shoved Lily ahead of me into the dusty, unused passage. "Keep moving, sweetheart. Follow the wire. It leads to the old drainage pipe. We're almost out." We scrambled through the stagnant air of the forgotten tunnel, Lily weeping but keeping pace, adrenaline replacing shock. Behind us, the sound of gunfire mixed with the splintering collapse of stone and the guttural shouts of highly trained men meeting in brutal combat. We reached a rough stone wall at the end of the passage. I located the barely visible, rusted inspection hatch I'd prayed still existed. I kicked out the brittle, corroded locking mechanism with my heel, sending the heavy metal door swinging open with a screech. A blast of cool, fresh night air hit my face, carrying the distant, confused sounds of sirens arriving from the main road. We had emerged into a shallow culvert several hundred yards from the Blackwood estate grounds. I pulled Lily up and out onto the muddy embankment, shielding her with my body as we stumbled away from the ominous glow emanating from the estate. We didn't stop running until the sound of the subterranean battle was reduced to a dull, distant thudding. Finally, we collapsed under the cover of a dense thicket. safe, but utterly spent. Lily was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching my arm. "We made it, Lily, we made it," I gasped, checking my ribs, knowing I was facing a long recovery. As the distant sound of official police procedure finally overtook the sounds of the firefight, Lily sniffled, looking back toward the lights flashing maniacally over the mansion. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice catching, pointing a trembling finger not toward the estate, but toward the empty, muddy ground right beside where we had fallen out of the pipe. There, lying discarded in the mud, glistening faintly under the moonlight, was the specialized cutting tool Marcus had been using to free her, the same tool he'd used to cut her restraints. And next to it, neatly placed as if waiting for me, was a single crisp white envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper with one word scrawled across it in heavy black ink. "Next,